So let me introduce to you Mr. Carl Cervone. Yeah? American, living in Ethiopia, working for TechnoServe, developing quality in Ethiopia. Haven't been to jail yet in Ethiopia. That's good. He's gonna give us a lecture about what you do there, and we're gonna cup some coffees afterwards. So big round of applause for Carl.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me here. It's my first time in Sweden. It's a wonderful, wonderful city. It's great to meet all of you. For many of you, this is, I guess, well, this is my first time to meet many of you, so that's very exciting for me. My presentation today is about developing new washed coffees from Ethiopia. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing as TechnoServe, as well as a bit about the structure, the industry, the way things, the way business is done in Ethiopia. So I hope that will be quite interesting. As some background, I've been living in Ethiopia for about 4 years now. Before that, I was working in Kenya and Tanzania and Rwanda, so I've spent about 8 years total in East Africa. When I was given the choice of a country to work in, I immediately jumped at Ethiopia. I think you can understand the reasons why. It's a fascinating place. As someone else said, you have the world and then you have Ethiopia. It's completely different in every way. The alphabet, the culture, the calendar even, basically everything that you could possibly imagine is different in Ethiopia. So for me, I found that a challenge. I found it quite interesting and exciting, and I haven't had any regrets moving there, although it's not always the easiest place to get things done. So a little background about TechnoServe. TechnoServe was founded in 1968, a little over 40 years ago, before we had the internet, before we had computers, and so the name TechnoServe was intended to mean technology for the service of mankind. The idea being that we could take technologies that are commonly used in Europe and in the West and help people in Africa and Latin America, parts of the developing world, to add value to their products. So since then, the name sounds a little bit funny. Many people think that we're an internet company or something like that, but we're actually a nonprofit that does work in a lot of countries in the world around agriculture. Coffee is one of the biggest commodities that we work in, especially in East Africa. But we also do work in cocoa and fruit, dairy, entrepreneurship, so a number of different things. We're a nonprofit organization. Our work in coffee is mostly funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so I was quite offended by your jabs at Microsoft. We do receive some funding from other public and private organizations. We're working mainly in the coffee sectors of East Africa, but we have some projects in Latin America as well, starting in Guatemala, also in Colombia and Nicaragua. In East Africa, we're working in Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda. We're doing some exploratory work in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Cameroon, the Arabica growing areas, and in South Sudan right now. We've been working in Ethiopia since 2009, so 3 years. We basically started working in Ethiopia when all of the regulatory changes took place. So we were there when the ECX was launched, and because of that, we had to quickly change our strategy, and you'll see how that's what that strategy looks like later on in my presentation. What's interesting about TechnoServe, from my perspective at least, is that there are many NGOs which, for better or for worse, they have what I would say, well, they will focus on doing something that may be right for a given community or small group of people, but when you look at the bigger picture, it may not always be scalable or sustainable. What I think is nice about TechnoServe's work is that we're trying to develop a win-win situation both for farmers as well as for buyers and consumers. So the success of our work, what the Gates Foundation and others are looking for us to deliver, is a higher quality product measured by the value of that coffee or the price increase that we're able to deliver, and also the share of that value that goes back to farmers. So it's one thing to have a great quality coffee, but it's another thing to also be able to show that the farmers are getting a high share of that price. So we look at both of those things, and those are the results that our funding is contingent upon. And as I said before, we hope this will create a win-win for everyone who's involved. So in Ethiopia, there are generally two types of processing. You have unwashed coffee, or natural coffee, sun-dried, and then you have washed coffee. And when I speak of unwashed coffees, there are various ways that this can be done, but the simplest way and the most common way is for every smallholder farmer, and there are over 1 million in Ethiopia, to dry the coffee at home, either on mats or on the ground. Some use raised beds, but that's probably the minority of farmers. Some even use goat skins. So this is a picture of coffee drying on a goat skin. As you can see, the quality is quite variable, and my guess it would have a leathery taste, probably to be generous. So there are a number of problems with a system where every farmer is processing coffee in their own way. As you can imagine, the quality is going to be very inconsistent. You have a lot of defects. Some days maybe the family goes away and they forget to cover the coffee, it gets rained on, or someone steps on it, so the quality can be all over the place. And as you know, with quality, if you can have 8 good beans and 2 bad ones, and the 2 bad ones are going to spoil the whole mix. So in general, the unwashed or the natural coffees produced in Ethiopia trade at a very low price. It's often seen as a substitute for Brazil's. At the same time, it's a relatively low margin business, and the farmers, because they are selling to a trader who's then selling to another trader, they often get a relatively low price for their coffee. So no one's really benefiting too much from this type of processing. However, 80% or so of Ethiopia's coffee is still processed in this way. Not all of it on goat skins, but certainly some of it. The alternative, in general, would be the washed coffee. So most of the coffees we've been cupping today are washed. Obviously, that's not to say that you can't have a well-processed natural coffee. You certainly can. It's just a bit more difficult to achieve. So I won't go into the details of how washed coffee is produced, but it certainly offers a number of benefits for farmers. It creates jobs. It saves them the activities they were doing before, where they would watch over the coffee, they would dry it at home, they would store it. So by producing washed coffee, they can simply pick the cherry and deliver it. So it saves them time and energy. And certainly when working with cooperatives, if they realize a profit from the sale, then that can be distributed back to the farmers as a second payment or a dividend. So there are a number of benefits for most farmers producing washed coffee as opposed to the traditional way of producing a natural or unwashed coffee. Show a few graphs here, but this is basically if you simplify the price breakdown for a natural coffee versus a washed coffee, and again I'm talking about the conventional natural coffees that aren't processed very well. They usually trade at a discount of about 20 to 30 cents compared to the C, and the farmer then gets about 70% of the value of that. This is compared to a washed coffee, which an average washed coffee, not a very high-end one, may get a premium of about 30 cents above the C. The costs are a bit higher, but the farmer's still getting a high share of the price, and they end up making a considerable amount of more money. And when they make more money, they can invest that into production, into planting more trees, into sending their children to school, all of those good things. So here's Ethiopia. I'm going to give a very quick tour of the different coffee growing regions in Ethiopia. You have Addis Ababa, which is right in the center of the country. And to the east, you have Harar. As you know, Harar is always produced as a natural coffee. It's a very dry area. There's not a lot of water for washed processing. And by virtue of the fact that this is a tradition which has been passed on from generation to generation, and probably some unique mix of the climate, the varietals they have there, this is one of the few examples of a natural coffee which is actually quite good and well accepted in the marketplace. So Harar coffees typically get a significant premium, and I don't think anyone has dreamed of washing them yet, which is probably fine. Wasn't good? Okay, so we'll keep those as a natural, yeah. In the south, you have the biggest washed coffee origin, which is Sidamo, of course. Sidamo is actually, it's a zone which is relatively small, but there's a lot of neighboring areas around Sidamo, which also have a similar cut profile, so they say, as the strictly speaking, the Sidamo zone of Ethiopia. And within the boundaries of what is generally considered to be Sidamo type coffee, you have an island of very high altitude coffee, most of it which is washed, and that's the Yirgacheffes. So if you were to look on a map, you would see that Yirgacheffe is surrounded by Sidamo, and there's often a lot of mixing of the two coffees. If it's a floral Sidamo coffee, they may pass it off as a Yirgacheffe, or if it's a lower altitude or a poorly processed Yirgacheffe, it'll often come in as a Sidamo. So there is a lot of mixing between the two. But in general, these are the coffees from the south. The majority are washed, but there's still a number of unwashed coffees coming from that area. In the west, you have a very, very large area, which is to the northwest of Addis Ababa, called Lekempt or Gimbi. They produce about 80,000 tons of coffee. Almost all of it is naturals. To put that in perspective, that's the total production of Kenya, Rwanda, and Burundi combined, almost. So it's a massive area. All of this is grown at pretty good altitudes, but very, very little, less than 1% is washed right now. So it's an interesting origin. We're starting some work there this year. And then also in the west, you have Jima. Jima has a pretty bad reputation in the marketplace because of Jima 5 coffee, which is basically the lowest common denominator for the unwashed or the natural coffees from Ethiopia. So basically anything which is dirty, defective, poorly processed is marketed as a Jima 5. Within the area which around Jima, the town of Jima, you have a lower altitude area producing washed coffee called Tepi and Babeka. And then you also have another area called Limu. And Limu is the area that we've been focusing on in the past 2 or 3 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the washed coffees from that part of the country. So this is a Google Earth map, and these yellow pins are washing stations in Limu. So here's the town of Jima, and then you can see to the north of it, as well as to the west, those are the coffee growing areas. So what's clear here is that there's a few very, very concentrated areas where there's a lot of washing stations. Particularly the one over here, this one here. These washing stations are in very close proximity to each other. It's a medium or lower altitude area. Most coffees are growing between 1,500 to 1,800 meters, which for Ethiopia is on the lower side. And when people associate, a Limu coffee, most of them have been tasting coffees from these areas. There's also a large state farm, which is off to the right over there, which is at higher altitude. It's called Limu Kosa State Farm, and that's where the name Limu came from. So that is why coffees from this area are given the Limu grade or the Limu origin. So what TechnoServe has been doing over the past 3 years is helping farmers come together, start a cooperative, or reform an existing cooperative and put in a washing station. So in the past 2 or 3 years, we've added about 63 washing stations in Western Ethiopia. the majority of them being outside of these traditional areas that where most limu coffee came from. So to classify them as a limu, I guess, is convenient because people are used to that name. And in Ethiopia, registering a new type or a new origin of coffee can be a bit difficult. So we call them a limu for lack of a better term. However, the truth is that we've discovered in the past couple of years that there's many different flavors and cup profiles in these areas. So to call it just a limu is probably selling it a bit short. So I'm going to take you quickly through some of the different areas that we are working in. Of course, with coffee, it's very difficult to isolate the factors which are contributing to quality. It can vary significantly from year to year. Of course, you have the varietal, you have the altitude, you have the way the coffee is processed. You have many factors which can affect the quality. So just having 2 or 3 years of experience cupping these coffees, I would say it's not enough time to really know how much is luck and how much is natural. But nonetheless, we've tried to group the coffees into a couple different types of flavors. So one of the areas right around Jima, it's a very high altitude area. We have one coffee on the table that we'll be cupping from this area. We've actually found these to be very, very interesting coffees, much more delicate and complex, some floral notes, which is quite surprising given that they're coming from very close to the town of Jima, which has this bad reputation typically. These are very interesting coffees. There's one on the table today. Another area around Limu, there's some very high altitude areas pushing 2,000, 2,100 meters, and I would almost compare these to a Kenyan type coffee, very bright, citrusy. Farther north of there, these coffees are a bit more subtle and refined, with some nice spicy attributes. Going west now, there's a valley, slightly lower altitude coffees, but we found them to be very rich, very good for blending. In Kaffa, where we're also working, volumes have been quite low in this area, so we're still working to get a good sense of what the qualities are like. We have 2 coffees from this area on the table. I have to say they're a bit all over the place. Even cupping coffees from the same cooperative, each lot can be very different because they may be coming from different parts or different altitudes. So it's an interesting area. I would be hard-pressed to say that there's a consistent profile that we get from these Kaffa coffees. So I would call them a little bit mysterious. Another area which is quite interesting for us, and we have one coffee from here, is around, there's a forest which goes from the district of Gera over to Kaffa. It's a very high altitude area, around 2,000 meters. These coffees have been very bright and floral, probably the sweetest coffees that we've come across in the West. A bit different than a Yirgacheffe, but people are quite surprised to hear these coffees come from Limu. Moving north, there's a large zone called Ilbabor. Again, another set of very high altitude coffees, 1,900 to 2,100 meters. Very rich, sweet, dark fruit, berries. We have one of these coffees on the table today. And then there's another forest area, a bit lower altitude, between 16 to 1,900 meters. Called Yayo. It's just been gazetted as a biosphere reserve by the United Nations. So there's a lot of forest coffees coming from here, as well as coffees planted by the farmers. Again, another area that I think deserves further research into the different cup profiles, but we've been getting a lot of dark chocolate and, I guess some wild flavors in that area. So in any case, this is just to demonstrate that there's a lot out there, and we're quite excited each year going into the harvest to cup these coffees and to see how they come out. Harvest is happening right now. So a little bit about what TechnoServe is doing. as I mentioned before, we are helping cooperatives get established and then install washing stations. So this really begins with selecting the cooperatives, getting them formed, electing new leaders in many cases. So you can see in this picture the farmers are voting for their leaders. After electing the leaders, we support them to create a business plan so that they can get financing. The financing is one of the most difficult things to organize in Ethiopia. There's a lot of conditions which regulate the flow of money in and out of the country. It's difficult for foreign banks or investors to put money directly into Ethiopia. So we've had to find a number of creative solutions to getting the financing to the cooperatives. With loans, we support the cooperatives to construct a washing station. And then we provide support for 2 or 3 years on processing of the coffee, the quality control, also on the business side, the accounting, the financial management, keeping track of labor, those types of things. We do a little bit of support on the marketing. To be clear, TechnoServe is we're not an agent. We don't get any income or commission from the sales of this coffee. We like to see ourselves as a broker, as an honest broker, helping buyers negotiate directly with the cooperatives. And we believe very strongly in financial transparency, specifically at the cooperative level, so that the members of the cooperative know what the leaders are doing with that money, and they understand the profit that they receive as a dividend later on. So to explain how I'm going to also give a quick overview of the marketing chain in Ethiopia. I think Mano touched on this earlier. There's 3 different types of supply chains that you have in Ethiopia. The ones that concern smallholder farmers, as Mano said, plantations, they're able to export their coffee direct, whereas the small farmers, which contribute probably 90% of Ethiopia's coffee, they essentially have 2 different options for how they sell their coffee. By far the largest is they sell their coffee to just a trader. It could be as a washed coffee or also as a natural. The trader then delivers that to ECX, and then exporters bid on the coffees that are stored at ECX and then export them to the final buyer or roaster. So unfortunately, ECX essentially acts as a wall between the private trader and the private exporter. So in the past, many exporters, they owned washing stations or they had suppliers that they did business with on a regular basis. With the ECX, that has changed the system so that any trader, they must deliver their coffee to ECX. It is given a lot number, and then exporters, they bid on these lots, but not knowing which coffee it is. So essentially, they're going into it and they're buying almost blind. So this is about 80 to 90% of exports from Ethiopia go through this type of supply chain. And because of the trading system at ECX right now, these are not traceable coffees, which means they cannot be certified, and you cannot say with any certainty where the coffee is coming from, which village, which district, or any of that type of information. So it prevents a relationship. Yeah, Tim?
Question. You said that the private trader buys from the farmers.
Yeah.
If he gets a very high price from the trade,
Yeah.
when he sells it, does any of the money go back to the farmer afterwards, or is the transaction finalized when they just buy it?
The transaction's essentially finalized when they buy the coffee from the farmer. I suppose if this were a socially responsible or a concerned private trader, they may share some of the profits, but by no means is that common. Yeah. So typically, these traders they will buy the coffee from the farmers. They may aggregate it or bulk it. They'll drive around with trucks collecting it from different areas. Then they'll deliver it to the ECX. And then private exporters, there's a trading floor, and they will bid on the different coffees. All the exporter will know is that they are buying a Sidamo grade 3 or a Yirgacheffe grade 2 or a Harar grade 4 through the ECX. And then when the coffee is sold, the trader will get their money. But there's no communication or linkage between the two. So essentially they are selling blind and the exporters are buying blind. The other chain is for the farmer to deliver their coffee to a cooperative, and then the cooperative to sell or to market that coffee through a union, and that allows a direct sale between the cooperative, the union, and the buyer and the roaster. So that accounts for about 10 to 20% of Ethiopia's exports, and many of these coffees can be traced back to the areas that they came from, even to the farmers. So this is the supply chain that that TechnoServe is focusing on, and it's not because, I guess, we believe that cooperatives are the only way to do good in the world. We think that a lot can be done through private traders and exporters, but given the regulatory framework in Ethiopia right now, this is the only way to have that traceability from the farmer all the way to the buyer. So because of that, we had to revise our strategy somewhat. So one of the things that we're also doing, which is a bit different in Ethiopia, is that the conventional way for cooperatives and unions to work together goes something like this. The cooperative, they will get financing from the bank or from the union or from another source, and they will buy the coffee from the farmers and process it, and then they will sell it to the union at the prevailing ECX price. The union will then market the coffee, they will deduct their costs from that, and then they will give 70% of the profit back to the cooperative later on in the year, once all of their accounts are finalized. And they keep 30% as a reserve. So we've been working on what we call a service provider type model, which means that the coffee is exported in the cooperative's name, and the union acts as a service provider. Originally, we had hoped that we could do this with private exporters, but we quickly found out that the government wanted it to happen through the unions. So we weren't able to work with private exporters, so the unions are acting as these service providers. They take a 5% commission for marketing the coffee and facilitating the export. They then deduct their costs, and then they give all of the net revenues back to the cooperative. So the good thing about this is that I guess there are several benefits. The first is that the coffee is essentially being exported in the cooperative's name. It's directly traceable back to that cooperative, and the service provider is only taking a relatively small commission on that. And obviously, there is an incentive for the service provider to try and get a higher price for it because their commission is based as a percentage of the export price that they get. On the other hand, under the traditional model, where the union is buying the coffee from the cooperative, that means they're then taking the risk and they're paying earlier. So that also has some benefits, and if the market were to drop and they were to get a lower price, then the cooperative would benefit. On the other hand, if the market were to go up, or if they're able to sell the coffee at a very high premium, then it is less efficient at delivering that premium back to the cooperative and back to the farmers. So in either case, once the money is returned back to the cooperative, they then pay a second payment or a dividend to the farmers. So farmers in most cooperatives, they get two payments, one at the time of the harvest and then another one later on in the year after all of the sales. So I guess one of the most important things, particularly at the cooperative level, that we believe in is financial transparency. And we bring cooperatives together and we discuss their performance. We discuss why one cooperative made a profit, why another one did not make a profit, the different factors that can contribute to that. So we have something called a transparency sheet, which is basically a summarized financial statement for each cooperative, explaining in a lot of detail their financial performance. So, you know, you may think that there's generally a direct relationship between the price that the coffee is exported at and the price that the farmer receives. However, if the cooperative only produces a very small amount of coffee, or they have very high operating costs, then it could be the case that a buyer is paying a very high price, but very little is getting back to the farmer. So by comparing the different factors which contribute to the profitability, we can explain, again, why some are getting a high payment and some are getting a lesser payment. Another thing that we are working on right now, both with these new cooperatives as well as some of the older ones, is I guess a way of differentiating their coffee into smaller lot sizes. So the convention, unfortunately, in Ethiopia is to bulk things, is to commoditize things. But obviously a lot can be lost by trading everything in mass. So we're working to define different lot sizes with different sizes of producers, so that hopefully we can differentiate qualities within the washing station, within the cooperative level. So for a small one, that could be as little as 50 bags of green coffee. And then for a larger one, which is doing several containers, we're hoping to get at least to a 1 container standard lot size of about 300 bags. I think several benefits of this. One is that quality can vary quite significantly during the harvest, especially at the beginning and the end of the harvest. Generally, the quality is lesser than at the peak of the harvest. So by separating out those first and last lots, we hope the ones in the middle may be better. It also allows you to keep, some days there may be a mistake that is made in the processing or the manager is not there. So if you can keep those qualities separate, then our hope is that it'll make the better qualities stand out. So just to finish up here, to give a sense of the current scope of our operations, we're working with about 63 new washing stations in Western Ethiopia. We're also doing some work with 11 older ones in the heartland of Limu. We have a project this year which is working in Gimbi, that area to the northwest, which has a lot of coffee, all of it naturals right now. Working with 4 washing stations there. One of them is new. And then we're also doing kind of a small project with 30 washing stations in Sidamo and Yirgacheffe. Again, focusing just on better lot differentiation and management at the cooperative level. So this harvest, and the harvest is underway right now, we're expecting about 3,000 tons of green coffee to come from all of these cooperatives, of which about half of that is new coffee that was not in the marketplace before. To put that in perspective, it may sound like a lot, but it's only about 2.5% of the washed coffee being produced from Ethiopia. So it's really just the tip of the iceberg. It's amazing how much coffee is out there and how little is known about it. So it may sound like a lot, but actually, in perspective, it's a very small amount. We have 6 coffees that I think we'll be able to cup now. They were roasted on Wednesday night in Ethiopia, and then I brought them with me. I think they may be a little bit darker than what we've been cupping today. I didn't roast them myself, but any feedback that you have, we'll give back to our quality manager. There's one sample from the area right around Jima. It's a site at about 1,900 meters. All these are washed coffees, by the way. We have 2 new crop samples from Kaffa. They're more medium altitude coffees. I haven't cupped them yet, so really have no idea what they're going to be like. We have one from Gera, which I hope will be an interesting coffee, a bit floral. There's also one from Garo area, very, very high altitude one up in the forest, and then a final one from Ilbabor. So I hope you enjoy the coffees, and unless there are any questions, we can go to the cupping. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. The Google Earth map. Yeah. Yeah. Right, so there's one coffee which is from this area. We have two from this area here. I'll put the labels on. Yeah. So one from the Jima Highlands, two from Kaffa, one from Gera, one from over here. Oh, sorry. One from Gera, one from over here, and then one from up here in Ilbabor. Yeah, 6 coffees total. The 2 from Kaffa are new crop, and then the 4 other ones are from last year's crop, but still well preserved and fresh. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. So all of these are from this general area around here. So from Addis Ababa to Jima, which is about here, that's about 350 kilometers. All the way out to Tepi and Babeka is another 250 or so kilometers. Yeah, on bad road, yeah. Up here is another 300 or so kilometers. I mean, it's a massive area which is growing coffee. And the thing which is interesting about Ethiopia is that, if you just were to look at a map and see all of the areas that have the altitude and the soils for coffee, it's much, much, much more than what's currently being used for coffee production. So Ethiopia is really one of the few countries in the world which could double, triple, quadruple its production without beating an eyelash. Yeah. It's quite different than Kenya, Rwanda, other countries which have the opposite problem where there's not enough land, farm sizes are getting smaller. In Ethiopia, there's still a lot that could be used for expansion.
In terms of varietals, I know that there's a lot of different varietals in Ethiopia. Is there like a clear difference between the areas? What kind of trees are growing?
I would say yes and no. There's certainly some areas which have more wild coffees, meaning that there's been less of the planted varieties that have been distributed to farmers. And then there are other areas where most of the coffee was planted recently. So in Kaffa, for example, and in Gera, another one that we'll have on the table, most of those coffees are wild coffees, or from mother trees, as they say, which means the farmers went into the forest, they took seedlings, they planted them on their farms, versus those who received their seedlings in the past 30 years or so from one of the nursery projects. Yeah, but as Mena was saying before, I mean, a given coffee could have 10, 20, 100, 1,000 different varietals which are going in there. Nobody really knows,
Coffee to go to Yirgacheffe, they don't agree with it. They're not allowed to do that. So they're the ones deciding on it. Yeah, they want to maintain, which is maybe good in a way, but you don't get anywhere because you don't know where to do it. They want to preserve certain cut profiles in certain regions as far as they can. Do you have any preference between these seedlings from the government or versus the wild coffee? Is there anyone that's clearly better? Or? Yeah, we did some trials in the past from Yirgacheffe. Just taking out 4 different and have them all separate, like I said. And it was very clear that the ones that were given by the government, they were not good. They had numbers, and they also have local varietals, which they all give different names. Even farmers can give a different name, but it's clear. You can even see the difference in the trees. But the research center is not very open. When you go there, it's very open, and then when you ask something, they didn't say anything.
I'm gonna pass the mic to Mena here. I'll let him take that one.
Yeah, well, a lot of people tried, of course, and we all at the Specialty Coffee Association of America did gather, and we had some meetings, and we were talking about it. And of course, they paid respect in terms of listening to it. And then they invented, which they called the second window. How do they call it again? The DST, the BST bullshit thing. So they invented it, and then very surprisingly for me, the SCAA, they sort of were happy with this solution, which is a total bullshit solution because nothing changed. All the coffees that were allowed to bypass the auction were coffees that were already allowed to bypass, so that nothing changed. But then that sort of I think they had a sort of an understanding not to bother each other anymore. So that's where we are.
We're also doing, so I didn't mention it now, but we're also doing an agronomy training program. So once the cooperatives have had 1 or 2 years of the mill support and they have improved quality and they're getting higher prices, then we also provide training to help increase the productivity. Yeah. So that's the more at the farmer level than the typical work. Yeah. So most of the money that we've had in Ethiopia has come from the Gates Foundation, so from Bill Gates, from Microsoft, and they have a lot of money in there. They're looking to spend it in Africa and the developing world. So yeah. So yeah. They're from Seattle, right? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is. There's a couple ways that I guess that direct trade can be done. Right now, it's a small percentage of the coffee. It has to come either from plantations or from cooperatives, but it can be facilitated. Yeah. Well. Yeah.
Traceable, yes. Direct, how direct can you get?
Yeah.
So from a farm, yes. A farmer can sell directly because he has all the capabilities to do it. Possible. The cooperative should be able to tell using the
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. I mean, even with the cooperatives, as Manu was saying before, I mean, we like the idea of having cooperatives export directly on their own, but it's currently not being encouraged by the government. And as Manu was saying, they're not educated. Even the chairman of the cooperative or the manager, you're lucky if that person has a high school education. So the complexities of exporting coffee, dealing with the banks and so on, are a bit much. So you need to have someone in there providing that service. Yeah.
Will we ever see a Congo Excellence from Ethiopia? Is it possible to tell the small farmers to hand them a couple of bags?
Yeah.
It should be the best country for it. Quality-wise.
Yeah.
It's interesting, I guess. But they're really scared. Rwanda is already a very organized country.
Mm.
That's already has all that. So I think that's a very long-term thing. It's really
Mm.
Most of these farmers are smallholders, right?
Yeah, exactly. So a farmer has less than a hectare typically, so maybe 2,000 trees. Yeah.
How many bags is that?
So the average farmer is getting about 5 or 6 bags of green coffee. Green coffee. Yeah, 5 or 6 bags. Yeah. In the west, at least. In the south, it's probably a bit less than that because the farms are smaller. Yeah.
You can go down,
Yeah.
buy it from the farmer, put it in a suitcase, fly back home directly.
You could do that. Yeah. You may get stopped at customs, but. Yeah. Any other questions or? you want a cup of coffees? Yeah. You want to see the map again? Or? Okay. Yeah. So I think, as Mena was describing earlier, the traditional system that you had was that you had exporters, and many of these exporters, they also had their own washing stations, or they had their own suppliers that they were working with. So under that system, if you had an exporter or a supplier that you trusted and that you wanted to work with, you were able to get those coffees directly. So many of them were certified, many of them were selling directly to many different roasters. With ECX, what changed in 2009 was that all private exporters and all private traders, or the collectors, had to use ECX. So they went essentially from a liberalized marketing structure to one which was very closely regulated in 1 year. So that first year there was a lot of problems that happened. Yeah. Why did they want that? We can turn off the camera in the back. I am going back to Ethiopia tomorrow.